Hello, it is now time for our read aloud. We are currently reading A Week in the Woods by Andrew Clements. We are on chapter 14, and I'm going to read right now. Chapter 14, Zero Tolerance. As the black Mercedes pulled into the school driveway at 7 o'clock on Monday morning, Mark wished that he'd gotten up earlier, or maybe Leon should have driven faster, because tons of other fifth graders were already at the school. Three big yellow buses sat at the curb, their doors open wide. Parked behind the buses, there were 5 pickup trucks and 4 minivans. The cargo beds of the first 2 pickups were already loaded with luggage. Mark saw a tall, rough-looking man talking with the principal. He had a clipboard, and so did Mrs. Gibson. She was pointing at the first bus, and the man was pointing at the second one. With a start, Mark realized what he was seeing. That tall guy? That's Mr. Maxwell. He was wearing dark brown trousers, tan lace-up hunting boots, a red flannel shirt, and a dark green jacket. His blaze orange cap was pulled down over a wild mess of graying brown hair, and it was plain to see that Mr. Maxwell had not shaved all weekend. He was headed for the woods. A group of other cars pulled up behind them, and Leon said, "Out you go now. You have a good time, Mark. Or how about you drive home and I will go to the state park, eh?" Mark grinned. "Sometime we'll go together, okay? And do some real camping. See you, Leon." Leon popped the trunk open and Mark jumped out. He grabbed his pack and slung it onto his back. It was about 3 pounds heavier than it had been when he had tried it out in his room that first night. The extra weight wasn't because of the last few items from Mr. Survival's list. The space blanket, the extra flashlight batteries, and the other items weighed almost nothing. He'd found a couple of other neat things at Walmart, too, like the saw that was just a piece of rough wire with a ring on each end, and the plastic emergency poncho. But that stuff was real light, too. The extra weight in his pack came from the school materials he was required to bring along. By the time Mark got onto the sidewalk, about 10 other kids were in line ahead of him, waiting to be checked in by Mr. Maxwell. Mark was surprised to see that 2 of the boys and one of the girls in the line had frame packs too. He suddenly wished he'd just thrown his stuff into an old suitcase. Compared to the packs these kids had, his looked brand new because it was, and his was also a lot fancier. The fact that his pack was bright yellow didn't help, and the 1 liter water bottles he had tucked into the mesh pockets on either side of his pack seemed silly now, unnecessary, like he was showing off or something. When it was his turn, Mr. Maxwell glanced at him, then ran a quick eye over his gear and said, "Toss that into the 4th pickup and then get onto the first bus." That was it. No greeting, no comment, no smile. On the bus, Mark was glad to see Jason Fraser sitting near the back. He waved at Mark and then pointed at the seat across the aisle from him. As Mark sat down, Jason said, "Did you check out old man of the mountain, Maxwell?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, I didn't even recognize him." "Takes his whole deal pretty serious, you know," said Jason. "Sort of too much, maybe. But who cares? No school, man, that's what I like. And my brother said the food's good, too. Not like the stuff at our cafeteria." When the bus was almost full, Mrs. Stearns and Mrs. Leghorn got on. Mrs. Stearns smiled and joked with a group of girls sitting near the front of the bus. She had on hiking boots, jeans, and a hooded sweatshirt. She was in a good mood, and she was ready for the woods. Mrs. Leghorn was wearing a pair of bright white tennis shoes, some pale purple slacks, and a long red wool coat with wide sleeves. A large black purse was looped over one arm, and in her other hand she kept a tight grip on a tall stainless steel coffee mug. She stood stiffly, flinching every time a kid yelled or laughed too loudly. Mrs. Stearns called off the names from the list on her clipboard. 2 kids hadn't arrived, but by the time she'd read off all the names, they had slipped aboard. The bus driver climbed on, buckled her seatbelt, yanked on the door lever, and as soon as Mrs. Stearns and Mrs. Leghorn took their seats, the bus lurched forward. A week in the woods had officially begun. When they arrived at Gray's Notch State Park, the boys on the first bus were divided up into 3 different groups. Mark and Jason and 8 other boys were assigned to a 1-room cabin called the Raven's Nest. A man named Mr. Frost, Jessica Frost's father, was their cabin chaperone. He looked nice enough to Mark, but he wasn't an outdoors type. More like a salesman, or maybe he worked in an office. Mr. Frost helped the boys find all their luggage, and then he led the way down the campground road, past the restrooms and bathhouses, past 3 RV slabs and 2 other cabins. Pointing at a log building down a short path from the road, Mr. Frost said, "Here it is, guys, home sweet home." The Raven's Nest had the smell of wood smoke and pine logs, and Mark liked the place instantly. It reminded him of a cabin at his summer camp, except this one was larger and brighter. 6 windows, one on either side of the door, and 2 on each of the long walls, let in the mid-morning sun. There were 6 bunk beds, 3 along each side wall, leaving an open space in the middle. The wooden floorboards were painted a pale gray. At the end of the cabin, opposite the door, there was a stone fireplace, but the opening had been covered with a sheet of black metal. A wood stove stood in front of the fireplace, and its black pipe ran up and then back into a thimble 2 feet above the fireplace mantel. The stove was lit, and it threw off a comfortable warmth. There were 3 sturdy tables, 2 on the left of the fireplace and 1 on the right side, each with 4 wooden chairs. The tabletops were made of thick pine boards. The chairs and the table legs had been painted dark green. While Mark stood in the middle of the room looking around, a mad scramble for the beds began. He turned and rushed to the nearest bunk, arriving at the same moment Jason did. But what looked like a contest never happened because Jason yelled, "I call top!" and Mark shouted, "I got the bottom!" Amid the jumble and noise, Mr. Frost said, "All right, boys, take it easy now. Plenty of room for everyone. Get your sleeping bags unrolled, set out your shoes and boots, just sort of get settled in. And if you got things to hang up like coats and jackets or towels, use the hooks on the walls, or the hooks on the ends of the bunks. Don't be throwing stuff around or dropping it wherever. We're going to be here a while, so keep things organized, okay? Now, on my schedule, it says we've got some time here before the general meeting at the Big Lodge at 11. But that doesn't mean you can wander off somewhere. No one goes anywhere unless I know about it first, and I mean anywhere. All week. We clear on that? Everyone?" All the boys nodded, so Mr. Frost said, "Good. Now most of your things should stay in your suitcases, and you should keep them pushed under your bunks so we're not tripping over them. So just get your stuff organized a little, and then we'll explore the area if there's time." It turned out there wasn't time, because once everyone was settled in, Mr. Frost decided to organize a firewood brigade. "Listen up, guys. It's not going to get above 50 today, and it's going to be downright chilly tonight. So, anybody who doesn't want to shiver all night, line up." All 10 boys from the Raven's Nest followed him down the road to the parking lot beside the gatehouse, at the entrance to the campground. Mr. Maxwell had arranged to have 2 cords of split stove wood dumped there. The boys lined up beside the pile, and Mr. Frost pulled back a corner of the big blue tarp and began to load wood onto the outstretched arms of the first couple of boys. Jason was in front of Mark. Mr. Frost stacked 3 pieces of wood onto Jason's arms, and then he motioned to Mark. But Jason said, "I can carry more than this. Give me 2 more, at least." So Mr. Frost said, "Okay," and put on another 2 pieces of wood. It was Mark's turn, and Mr. Frost put 3 pieces of wood on his arms and then said, "Next boy." But Mark shook his head and said, "I can take at least 2 more pieces, maybe 3. Jason had turned to start walking back, but when he heard Mark say that, he looked over his shoulder and said, "Sure you can, in your dreams." But Mr. Frost shrugged and said, "Fine," and loaded Mark with 2 more chunks of wood. When the last piece of wood was balanced on his stack, Mark turned and started walking. Jason was about 20 feet ahead of him. Mark lengthened his stride. After about 30 seconds, he was only a step or 2 behind. Mark felt the muscles in his shoulders complain about the weight of the wood, felt his wrists ache from being bent upward at such an odd angle. But he didn't care. With a grim smile, Mark notched his speed up a little higher. As if he had radar, Jason glanced over his shoulder and saw Mark closing in. He grinned. "Oh, no, you don't," he said, and he sped up. It was an all-out race. Every time Mark tried to pass him, Jason accelerated and swerved like a NASCAR driver. Both boys were huffing, their faces red from exertion, and they zoomed by the other 2 kids who had loaded up before them. At the last second, Mark surged forward and managed to get next to Jason. Shoulder to shoulder, they reached the path. They went left from the roadway back toward the Raven's Nest. The path went between 2 trees, and it was narrow, and Jason had the inside position. Mark had to give way, but he wouldn't, and he didn't. The racers collided, their loads of wood clunking into the tree trunks and clattering to the ground as the boys tumbled into each other and collapsed into a gasping, laughing heap. Jason reached over and gave Mark a friendly thump in the arm. "That was cheap. I had you all the way." "Yeah," said Mark. "Then how come you're flat on your back?" Jason didn't answer, and Mark sat up and turned to look at him. Jason was looking up over Mark's shoulder. He wasn't smiling. Someone said, "You all right?" Mark knew that voice. It was Mr. Maxwell. The boys scrambled to their feet, and Jason said, "Oh, sure, we're fine. We bumped into each other, that's all," said Mark, turning to face the man. When Mr. Maxwell saw it was Mark, he scowled and then spoke gruffly. "Well, be more careful, both of you. Now get that mess cleared away." Then he turned on his heel and walked off toward the lodge. Jason and Mark started picking up the wood. When Mr. Maxwell was far enough away, Jason whispered, "I still beat you, loser." Mark whispered back, "Dream on. Maybe you tied, but only because my wood was heavier than that little baby load of yours." Once their wood was stacked outside the door, Jason chased Mark into the cabin and they beat on each other with pillows until Mr. Frost arrived and added, "No pillow fights," to his list of rules. After the big meeting in the lodge, everyone ate lunch, had a restroom break, and then gathered outside in the council clearing at 1 o'clock. All the kids sat on logs that were arranged in a series of expanding circles. It was like an outdoor auditorium, and the stage was in the center, except it wasn't a stage, just an open space with a stone fire pit. Next to the fire pit, there was a big iron bell mounted on a sturdy wooden post. Once everyone was settled, Mr. Maxwell said, "We're going to start off our week in the woods with the annual nature study scavenger hunt. Here's how it works." Then he explained that they would split into teams made up of one boys' cabin and one girls' cabin, about 20 kids and 3 or 4 grown-ups each. Every team would get the same list of 75 things to search for. Little things like an acorn, a piece of mica, a white oak leaf, a pine cone, a piece of quartz, a piece of granite, a shred of birch bark, an aspen leaf, a maple twig, on and on. Mr. Maxwell explained the special rules designed to keep the park from being trampled or ripped up, especially rules about where to search and how to collect the samples. For example, all the plant samples had to be picked up off the ground, never from living trees or bushes. Each team had to stay in a certain area of the campground. Plus, every hunter had to keep a written record of where each object had been picked up so that everything could be returned to its right place in the ecosystem after the hunt. After all the explanations, Mr. Maxwell said, "There's a 1-hour time limit, and you've all got a lot of things to find, so let's get going." Then he pretended to remember something. "Oh, I almost forgot to tell you. Members of the last place team will have to help serve and clear the tables at dinner tonight, and everybody on the winning team is going to get an extra helping of dessert. So is everyone ready?" 150 kids yelled, "Yeah!" Mr. Maxwell rang the bell and the hunt was on. For an hour, the woods around the campground echoed with the shouts and yells of the hunters. "Quartz! I got a chunk of quartz!" "Hey, quick, over here! I found a birch branch on the ground." Squads of kids picked their way carefully through the search areas. There were arguments and discussions. Notes were scribbled into the logbooks, and as time ran out, the pace intensified. And all the while, the parents and teachers kept careful watch to be sure no one strayed off into the woods in search of that perfect granite pebble or a missing hemlock cone. When the big bell at the council clearing rang at 2:15, all the teams gathered for the judging. That part of the event was almost as noisy as the collecting had been. It went quickly, with 3 teams of judges moving from group to group. There was a lot of cheering and clapping, and there were more arguments, too. Disputes about what would count and what wouldn't were settled by Mr. Maxwell. Mark watched carefully as the judges went over his team's collection. He and Jason had worked as a pair, and together they had found 18 items for the team. Altogether, their group had found 62 of the 75 things on the list before time ran out. But they didn't win. Another team had found 67. They wouldn't be having an extra dessert, but they wouldn't have to clear the tables either. At 3 o'clock, Mark and his cabin mates headed back to the Raven's Nest for a half-hour break before the next activity. The cabin had cooled off a little, so Mr. Frost got the poker off the wall by the fireplace, opened the door of the stove, and raked some live coals toward the front of the firebox. Then he put a couple of small logs into the stove, shut the door, and began to fiddle with the airflow adjustment. Mark sat down on his bed. After unlacing his hiking boots, he pulled his pack out from under the bunk to look for his Jack London book. Jason sat down at the other end of Mark's mattress and started rooting around in his suitcase. Just as Mark found his book, Jason whispered, "Hey, Mark, check this out." Looking around carefully, he reached toward Mark with something in his hand. Mark put out his hand, and as he took it, Jason whispered, "Turn toward me so no one sees it." Mark held the thing close to his body and took a quick look down. It was a brown leather case about 4 inches long, an inch and a half wide, and 1 inch thick. The flap on the front was held shut with a round copper snap. There had once been some gold lettering on the flap, but it was mostly worn away. The thing weighed a lot, almost half a pound. "Go on," urged Jason. "Take it out." Mark tugged the snap open, lifted the flap, and pulled out something made of stainless steel. Turning it over in his hands, it looked like two separate rectangles of metal, hinged together at one end. Then Mark knew what it was. He'd seen things like this on the REI website. They called them multi-tools. He nodded at Jason and whispered, "Cool." Taking hold at the end opposite the hinge, Mark pulled the sides of the tool outward, folded them all the way around, and in 2 seconds the object was transformed into a pair of sturdy, needle-nose pliers. "This is great." And it was. The tool was wonderfully made, solid and heavy in his hand. The door of the cabin slammed, and Mark turned instinctively toward the sound. Then he quickly turned back and tucked the tool under his leg. Mr. Maxwell stood in the doorway. He talked to the whole cabin, but his eyes kept coming back to Mark. "How's it going here in the Raven's Nest? Looks like you've got everything you need. I'm just checking every cabin to make sure everyone's comfortable. You guys are great, though. Got a fire going, got your wood pile started. Looks like you're all set." Mr. Frost was on his feet, smiling at Mr. Maxwell. "Oh, we're doing just fine, just fine. Terrific bunch of boys here, and we can't wait for dinner." "Won't be long now," Mr. Maxwell said. "Right after your meetings with the subject teachers. I'll see you all there, okay?" He turned, put his hand on the doorknob, and then hesitated. Turning back around, he walked over to Mark. He pointed down at the bunk and said, "Unless I'm mistaken, you're hiding something under your leg there. Am I mistaken?" Mark gulped, then he shook his head. "No, you're right, it's a tool." And he reached under his leg, picked it up, and held it out. Mr. Maxwell took it from him. In his big hands, the tool looked like a toy. He turned it over once or twice. Then he bent the ends around and folded the pliers back into the handles. Holding it up between his big thumb and forefinger, Mr. Maxwell wagged the tool at Mark and said, "I'm sorry I found this. You shouldn't have this here." Nodding at the bed, he said, "Hand me the sheath." Mark gave it to him. Pointing below the bunk, Mr. Maxwell said, "Grab your pack and get all your stuff into it." Mark was confused. "All my stuff? Why?" "Why?" said Mr. Maxwell. "I'll tell you why. Because of this." And holding the tool in one hand, he flipped at the edge with his thumb. Out popped a 4-inch blade. "This is a knife." And the instructions for a week in the woods said no student was to bring a knife of any kind. But it's more than that, because this is a school-sponsored event. So this is really school, just like a field trip or an assembly. And our district has a zero-tolerance rule about bringing weapons to school. So this knife means you are going to be suspended from school." Mr. Maxwell folded the knife blade back into the handle, put the tool into its case, and then dropped it into his jacket pocket. "So, like I said, pack up all your stuff. Now, you know what my truck looks like? The old blue GMC?" Almost in a daze, Mark nodded. Mr. Maxwell said, "It's parked in the lot by the gatehouse. Toss your stuff in the back and wait for me in the cab. You're going home." Then Mr. Maxwell turned and walked out the door. Except for the metallic creaking of the wood stove, it was silent in the Raven's Nest. Mark's face was burning hot. Feeling as if he was moving in a dream, he stood up, turned around, bent down, and started rolling his sleeping bag. Jason jumped to his feet. Mark looked up, and Jason pointed at himself, mouthing the words, "I should tell." Mark shook his head. "No," he whispered. "I'm the one who got caught. I'll get in less trouble than you would. Really, it's okay." It took Mark less than 3 minutes to load his pack and strap the rolled sleeping bag to the bottom. He stepped clear of the bunk, swung the pack around onto his back, and walked to the door. Stopping, he looked back, glancing from face to face around the room. He saw a lot of pale faces, even a couple of watery eyes. Forcing a thin smile to his lips, Mark said, "See you guys. Sorry." Then he left. So, a pretty crucial point in the book. Mark has not even been at a week in the woods for a whole day, and he's already been suspended and going home by Mr. Maxwell. So we'll have to see what happens in the next chapter. There was a map in this chapter that I'm going to try to make sure gets into your Google assignment here for watching or for listening and watching this chapter. So keep a lookout for that too. Okay? All right. Have a good day, everyone, and make a great one too.